The night did not begin with a declaration of war. There was no warning, no official announcement, only silence. And then the sky burned. In the early hours of the morning, radar screens lit up across the Middle East. Missiles cut through the darkness like blazing spears. Air raid sirens screamed. Borders that had remained technically at peace for decades suddenly became meaningless lines on a map. This was not a sudden war. This was a war decades in the making. This was Israel versus Iran. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, we must go back, not years, but generations. Because this conflict was never just about land or missiles or power. It was about ideology, fear, survival, and a belief on both sides that the other must never be allowed to win. In the early years after Israel's creation in 1948, Iran was not an enemy. Under the rule of the Shah, Iran quietly recognized Israel. Trade flowed. Intelligence cooperation existed behind closed doors. Israeli engineers worked in Iran. Iranian oil flowed westward. For a brief moment in history, the two nations stood on the same side of the Cold War chessboard. Then came 1979. The Iranian Revolution changed everything. The Shah fell. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini rose to power. And with him came a new ideology, one that viewed Israel not as a rival, but as an illegitimate state that must be erased. From that moment forward, Israel was no longer just a political opponent in Iranian eyes. It became the little Satan. Iran cut all ties. Israeli flags were burned in the streets of Tehran. And for the first time, the idea of Israel's destruction was written directly into the language of a ruling government. But even then, there was no open war. Not yet. Instead, a shadow war began. Israel, surrounded by hostile neighbors, adopted a doctrine shaped by one core belief: never fight on your enemy's terms. Strike first, strike silently, survive at all costs. Iran, meanwhile, understood its own limitations. It could not defeat Israel in a conventional war, not directly. So it chose a different strategy, a web of proxies. Over the years, Iran funded, trained, and armed groups across the region. In Lebanon, Hezbollah rose into one of the most powerful non-state militias on earth. In Gaza, militant groups received support. In Syria, Iranian forces entrenched themselves under the cover of civil war. This was not coincidence. This was encirclement. Israel saw it clearly, a tightening ring of enemies slowly closing in. Israel responded the only way it knew, with precision. In 2007, Israeli jets crossed into Syrian airspace and destroyed a secret nuclear reactor at Al-Kibar. No speeches followed, no celebrations, just silence. The message was clear. If you approach the nuclear line, we will act. That message was meant for Iran. Throughout the 2010s, reports surfaced of mysterious explosions at Iranian facilities. Scientists died under unexplained circumstances. Cyber attacks crippled infrastructure. The world whispered one word: Mossad. Iran denied nothing. Israel confirmed nothing. But the shadow war was no longer invisible. And then came the issue that pushed the conflict toward the edge of catastrophe: Iran's nuclear program. To Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran was not a threat. It was an existential nightmare. Israeli leaders across the political spectrum agreed on one thing: Iran must never obtain nuclear weapons.
Iran, on the other hand, insisted its program was peaceful, meant for energy and national pride. Yet enrichment levels rose, facilities expanded, tensions escalated. In 2015, the world tried diplomacy. The nuclear deal offered Iran sanctions relief in exchange for limits on its nuclear activities. For a moment, the clock slowed. But Israel was never convinced. And when the deal collapsed years later, the countdown resumed. By the early 2020s, the Middle East was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. That spark came not from Tehran or Jerusalem, but from the battlefields between them. Missile exchanges between Israel and Iranian-backed forces intensified. Drones crossed borders. Ships were attacked at sea. Each side blamed the other. Each response grew stronger than the last. Then, one strike went too far. A high-ranking Iranian commander was killed in an airstrike. Iran promised retaliation, openly, publicly, without ambiguity. For the first time, Iran did not hide behind proxies. It struck directly. Missiles launched toward Israeli territory. Some were intercepted, others were not. Israel responded within hours. Air bases activated, squadrons took off. Targets deep inside Iranian territory were selected, not symbolic, but strategic. The shadow war had ended. The open confrontation had begun. As Israeli aircraft penetrated Iranian airspace, the stakes reached levels unseen in modern Middle Eastern history. This was not Israel versus a militia. This was Israel versus a sovereign regional power. Iran's air defenses roared to life. Explosions lit the night sky over multiple cities. Military installations, radar sites, and weapons depots were hit. Iran retaliated with volleys of missiles and drones, not only toward Israel, but toward Israeli allies and regional assets. The conflict widened by the hour. Markets trembled, oil prices surged, world leaders rushed to emergency meetings. The word World War began trending globally, because everyone understood one terrifying truth. If this war spiraled out of control, it would not stay regional. The United States watched closely. For decades, it had been Israel's most powerful ally, but direct involvement carried enormous risk. A miscalculation could pull global powers into a conflict with no clear end. Russia and China called for restraint while quietly calculating their own interests. Arab nations, long divided, faced an impossible choice: remain neutral or be dragged into the storm. Meanwhile, civilians paid the price. Cities emptied, shelters filled, families waited in darkness, listening for explosions, praying the next siren would not be their last. This was no longer about strategy, it was about survival. Inside Israel, the memory of history weighed heavily. A nation born from catastrophe had always believed one thing: never again. Inside Iran, national pride and revolutionary ideology collided with the reality of modern warfare. Neither side could afford to appear weak. Neither side could afford to lose. And so the conflict reached a dangerous equilibrium, intense enough to devastate, restrained enough to avoid total annihilation. For now. Because wars like this do not truly end. They pause, they reset, they wait for the next spark. And as the world holds its breath, one question echoes louder than all the explosions combined. Was this the war that would finally redraw the Middle East, or merely the opening chapter of something far worse? History has not yet given us the answer. But one thing is certain: the Israel-Iran conflict is no longer a shadow on the wall. It is real, it is visible, and it is shaping the future.